Hi, I'm Dan Augusto for GearWire.com, and we're doing a screencast for the drum replacement tool. It's called the Raven DRT from Digital Black. So to basically showcase what this piece can do, what I've done is created some drum tracks because we need separate drum tracks pretty much for this plugin to work correctly. In our case, we're using a drum machine, yes, but I've rendered out kick track separate from the snare track, and then everything else. So let's take a listen to what our kick track sounds like. Here's our snare track, and then here's everything else. So right here is just hi-hat. There's some cymbals and some toms. And we got this looping inside of Sonar 6. So this is the track that we've created with Session Drummer 2 in Sonar 6. And what I'd like to do is replace our snare drum. And to do that, I'm going to open up the Raven plugin. And you can hear right off the bat that our snare drum is now gone. So what we can do is actually, I can mix in the old snare track, and you can mix in between both whatever you're feeding the Raven and what the Raven's outputting. But since it's not outputting anything right now, we're not going to hear snare. So we're going to keep this real simple and just use one sample. You can use lots of samples with up to 8 velocity layers, but we're just going to use one. So what I'm going to do is just bring down everything and keep our sample right up at the top. I'm going to bring in a snare that has a little bit more body to it. And so it's loaded in, we can hear it's late, and there's multiple triggers, all sorts of problems. First thing we probably can deal with, since we're hearing those multiple triggers, is the release time. Just raise that up. What that does is prevent any stray triggers to happen while the natural sound of the snare is decaying. So that sounds pretty good. We also need to speed that up a little bit because it's lagging behind, so we're going to turn down the trigger time. So we're also hearing another double trigger. This trigger time has a lot to do with how the sound of the snare that you're feeding it is. A lot of times, say if you're using like a dynamic mic or the player is hitting a certain way, it won't actually hit the peak of its volume till a little bit after the stick actually hits the drum. So this is used to adjust for that. Also, we have our threshold. If we raise that up, that means eventually we're not going to hear any triggering, because the threshold, when the sound actually raises above the threshold, is when we hear the trigger happen. So as we can hear, that stopped triggering. It's usually good to set this as low as possible. Up here we have different curve settings. Basically what this does is however loud the sound is going into the Raven, it responds on a different curve. The +2 curve is a steeper curve. The 1 curve is less steep. Linear is perfectly linear. -1, of course, sort of eases into it a little bit more. -2 does more so. Max, just every time it hits above the threshold, it's feeding it the full power of the hit. And actually right now that's not doing much for us. So I'm going to leave it on +2. And that's doing fine. Mask time we could also use if we're having more trouble with multiple hits. What that does is it sets a time constant. After one trigger, there's a certain amount of time that another trigger cannot be created. Filter section, we don't really need to worry about that right now. That would be used in the case if you have bleed. Say you have a hi-hat bleeding into a snare drum. Using the filter, you can take out some of that hi-hat to what's going to the sensor circuitry, and therefore the hi-hat will no longer trigger the snare sample. So we have our snare sound pretty good. It sounds pretty much in time, and we're not hearing any weird triggers. So let's mix in some of the old one. So here's the old one, And as I move it to the right, we'll hear more of our sample. All right. So we can hear what we can do pretty easily with that. So the only problem here is it's a little off time-wise. Most people wouldn't mind about it, but let's do that here. So what I'm going to do is turn the mix all the way to the wet side, all the way to the sample. And we see we're sampling really high here. So I'm going to bring down the volume of this a bit, just so we're not clipping. Here we go. All right. So that looks pretty good there. And what I'm going to do, since we're hearing only the sample that Raven is outputting, I'm going to go ahead and highlight that. And in Sonar, we just grab Bounce to Tracks, select the tracks as the source. We're going to use just a mono because it's a mono sample. There's fine. All right. So now we have the Raven DRT signal. I can go ahead and delete the track, the VST off the original track, and we can actually go ahead and mix these two together independently. And what I'm going to do is start out with the snare just a little lower than I would usually have it. I'll unsolo everything. And now I'll just bring in the sample till it sounds all right. Sounds a little better. And one other thing I want to do is zoom in, and I can actually grab this track and bring it up next to the original track. And as you might see, there's just a little bit of delay. So I can nudge that over and get even further in and make sure that the hit starts right at the same time. One thing that we can see, actually looking at the waveform, is that there are some complex sort of wave interferences going on. So if we solo this track out, you might want to try a phase reversal. All right, sounds about the same. The interactions are complex enough so that it's not creating any sort of dropout in certain frequency bands. So here we have our perfectly lined up sample, and I think we have a markedly improved snare sound. So that is the Raven DRT from Digital Black. Thanks for checking it out here at GearWire.com.